So thanks a lot to Dairisha and the other organizers for the invitation. And I decided to talk about these disentangled representations that are becoming very popular in the machine learning community. Just come back from cosine, and I was speaking at the workshop there about these disentangled representations, and that was by far the most popular workshop at cosine. And the reason why I'm talking to this community about these entangled representations are at least two. So the first one is that if you want to build a neuromorphic system that actually works and is able to generalize, you probably want to take into account the fact that you actually see these disentangled representations everywhere in the real biological brain. And I still believe we can learn something from the real brain, and so that's probably something to keep in mind. The second reason is that we developed a certain number of analytical tools to try to study these entangled representations and to identify them by looking at the representational geometries. So that's also something that could be useful if you want to know whether your system is actually generating this kind of representations or not. Okay, so I have here a list of all the people who have been involved in essentially what I'm going to tell you about. And it's too long to go over name by name, but I will mention all the relevant names and then later as soon as I introduce the real data. But the amazing thing is that I'm collaborating with this fantastic team of people who are not only doing experiments in rodents, monkeys, and humans, but they're also performing this analysis that I just mentioned that are completely new and really interesting because they're very similar for all these kind of systems and they can be applied to any artificial system. Okay, so let me start by explaining what a disentangled representation is. Maybe most of you are already familiar with it, but I want to introduce every concept. And I'll start with a very simple example. So let's say that you live in this very simple world, this MNIST land, where you have these MNIST digits. And it's a really simple word. Not only you have only digits, but you don't even have all the digits. You just have 4 digits. So here you see a lot of ones, then on the second row, a lot of twos, and so on. If you want to survive in this world, one of the things that you certainly need to do is to figure out whether there are any irregularities in the kind of stimuli that you encounter. So for instance, if you use the right representation, you might find some good reasons to group together all the ones into a single category. So essentially, a category is a collection of items. They share something. And in this particular case, they probably have some similarities, some visual similarities. But in general, they don't have to. So, basically, a category is a collection of items that you're grouping together for some purpose that could be related to the semantics of these different visual stimuli, or it could be dictated by the structure of the stimuli. So they're grouped together and they're considered equivalent for some purpose. Now, this is one simple category. You can have more complex categories. So for instance, you might want to group together all the odd digits. So this is a more cognitive category. And again, it might depend on the kind of task that you perform, whether this is something useful to do or not. Okay, so what I'm going to discuss now is how you could represent these groups of different items or categories. And in particular, I'm going to discuss what could be a concept, which is usually considered a mental representation of a category. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce, and I'm going to use a lot, this representation. So this is the firing rate space or the activity space. So along each axis, you have the firing rate of a different neuron. So this is F1, for neuron 1, neuron 2, neuron 3. So in general, you're going to have hundreds or even thousands of axes. But I want to give you an intuition, so I'm going to show you only 3 dimensions in these very simple examples. Okay, so now let's say you encounter a 1 in this MNIST land, and you record the activity from your brain of these 3 different neurons. That would give you essentially one vector with 3 components that is a point in this space. So for instance, it would be here. Now, what I'm going to represent with this dot is actually the centroid of a cloud of all the ones that represent the different instances of these digits. Now, let's say I'm going to consider now a representation where these centroids are at random locations. Okay, so this is the first type of representation that I want to consider. If they're random location, they basically define an object that has the maximal dimensionality, especially if you consider a high dimensional space. In this particular case, in which I have only 4 different digits, I'm going to have 4 centroids. And that defines the tetrahedron, which has the maximal dimensionality that you can have when you have 4 points. Okay, so now you can actually see this very nicely. If you rotate it, you can identify this structure. All the points are well separated, and they're distinct. So there is a lot of information about these digits. In particular, you can even use a very simple linear decoder, which will be represented by a plane in this particular case, to separate the odd digits from the even digits. Okay, so in this case, 1 and 3 would be on one side of the plane, 2 and 4 would be on the other side. Okay, now the problem with this kind of representation is that basically the concept of parity, whether you have an odd digit or an even digit, is not really a special concept. Basically, you can separate the points in any way you like, which is certainly a huge advantage if you want to have some kind of flexibility of retraining your system rapidly and responding in a different way. But it doesn't make any of these categories special. So let's look at the different representation, and that I have here on the right. So this is a lower dimensional representation. In particular, the 4 points now are at the vertices of a square. Now, the nice features of these representations are that now you're grouping together the different stimuli if you consider subspaces. So for instance, if I consider this line, which is clearly one subspace, and then I project all the points along this line, you see that 2 and 4, the even digits, will be together, and 1 and 3 will be together. Okay? So now this concept of parity is special, is different from the other dichotomies, the other ways of grouping together the different digits. And in particular, it has also this nice property that the coding directions, if I consider, for instance, the small digits 1 and 2, or the large digits 3 and 4, the coding directions for parity are the same. So these lines are parallel. And this gives you an enhanced ability to generalize. For instance, you can train a decoder only on the small digits, and it would work right away for the large digits. Now, this is true not only for parity, which is one possible concept, but also for other concepts. And in particular, in this case, you can have actually 2 different concepts that are represented in this low dimensional format. The other one could be magnitude. And again, here you can see these 2 coding directions that are parallel. So here you go from a small digit to a large digit, and again, small digit and large digit. Okay, so these kind of representations are called disentangled or factorized. We call them abstract because this nice enhanced ability to generalize is really the signature of the process of abstraction. And if you look at in single neuron properties, they've been named axis code by Doris Sau. You can definitely see them in the real brain, or linear mixed selectivity. Okay, so here you basically have that you can represent a certain number of concepts, these different categories, and each of them corresponds to one latent variable. So in this case, you would have parity along this direction, magnitude along this other direction, and they define 2 approximately orthogonal subspaces. In this case, actually, they're perfectly orthogonal. Okay, so this is something, this kind of representations can be obtained by training, for instance, variational autoencoders that see a large number of samples. So, this is a beautiful example from Irina Higgins at DeepMind, where you have a very large number of chairs that have different styles, different width, different rotation, different azimuth. You present all of them to this variational autoencoder, and variational autoencoders can discover these latent variables automatically. So then you would have this nice structure here. So the leg style might be encoded along one direction and the azimuth might be encoded along an orthogonal direction. Okay, so now essentially when you move from this very high dimensional representation that you have on the left to this low dimensional representation that you have on the right, you have this enhanced generalization. But you have to pay a small price for this because you lose some linear separability. So, if this is the kind of representations you really want to read out to make your decision, there are things that you would not be able to do with this kind of low dimensional representation. So, for instance, if you want to separate 1 and 4 from 2 and 3, that would be equivalent to the exclusive OR problem, and you would not be able to do it with a linear decoder. Now, the kind of representations that we actually see in the brain, and that's something I'm going to show you in a second, are neither this nor this kind of representations, but there's something intermediate. So you basically have some kind of low dimensional scaffold, as in this simple case that I'm illustrating here. And then you have some nonlinear distortion. Okay, so you see here it's really tilted. And so these kind of representations are a really nice compromise. They have the nice generalization properties of the low dimensional structures that you have here on the right, but at the same time, they allow you to separate the points in any way you like. Okay, and we often see this kind of representations. And depending on the brain area or the species that you're considering, you might be a little closer to this very low dimensional representation or to this high dimensional representation. Okay, so how do we find these kind of representations in the brain or in artificial systems? So we have a few ways of characterizing these representational geometries. Okay, so the geometry is really the arrangement of these points in the firing rate space or in the activity space. So one is inspired by essentially what I discussed in my first slides. So one important properties of these representations is that you have the parallelism of the coding direction. So we define a parallelism score that looks directly at that. And parallelism is never obvious in a high dimensional space. So if you find it, then you can actually set up a very nice statistical test to say for sure this is a representation that has something special. Okay. So the second quantity that we use to characterize this representational geometry is what we call cross-condition generalization performance. And again, it's related to some computational properties of these representations, and in particular to something that I already mentioned. So for instance, let's say you train a linear decoder on a subset of conditions, in this case, only on the small digits, ones and twos. And you train it to report the parity of the digits, so whether it's odd or even. You can find this hyperplane, and this hyperplane would work right away in this other case. Okay? So for the large digits. So you're going to test it on the large digits. So this decoder has never seen the large digits. So these are completely novel digits. And it's a typical interesting situation for generalization. And if it's about chance, it means that there is some underlying nice low dimensional structure that allows you to do that. Because for instance, in the tetrahedron, this would not work. It would be really a chance value. Okay, so the third quantity we look to characterize the geometry is some measure of the dimensionality. And in particular, it's what we defined as the shattering dimensionality. So we are looking at all possible ways of shattering these groups of points. So I'm looking at a full set of points, and I consider all possible dichotomies, all possible ways of dividing the points into two groups. So in this particular case, it's parity. I have odd digits on one side, even digits on the other side, and I want to know whether linear decoder can separate them. Okay, so this would work also for magnitude, and it would work actually for all the dichotomies in this simple case, except one, which is the one that I already mentioned, where you want to separate 2 and 3 from 1 and 4. So the shattering dimensionality is defined as the average decoding accuracy of a linear decoder when I consider all possible dichotomies. And it's 1 when you have the maximal dimensionality, and it's around chance when you have the minimal dimensionality. Okay, so we used all these 3 different quantities to characterize the geometries. I'm not going to show you actually all these quantities, except in one case to illustrate how they work. And we are going back now to the MNIST length, and I'm considering 8 digits. And in this case, I'm going to consider, first of all, this dichotomy, which is, again, parity, odd versus even. And I'm going to test our metrics on a very simple artificial system. It's just a feed-forward network where I use as an input the representations of these digits. And then I have 2 intermediate layers. And I train this network to report whether a digit is odd or even, and at the same time, whether it's small or large. So I'm encouraging the system to essentially represent the information about parity and magnitude in a special way. Of course, it's not guaranteed that you get it, but you can actually find representations that have all these nice properties that I just explained. So let's focus on the second layer, and let's look at the representations. So I projected the representations in a low-dimensional space using a multidimensional scaling. And now you can see these are many different instances that we use for testing the network. And you see that they are arranged very nicely at the vertices of a square. And I colored the digits according to whether they're odd or even in this case. But you can clearly see that parity is encoded along this direction, and magnitude is encoded in the orthogonal direction. Okay, so now you can do the analysis. And you would start from a traditional way of characterizing the kind of information that is encoded in these representations, which is to try to decode information about all these different dichotomies. So I'm considering all possible dichotomies, not only parity and magnitude. And you see that you can actually decode all of them. Okay, so this means 2 things. The first one is that the shattering dimensionality is pretty high in this case. The second one is that if you just consider the information that is encoded about every variable, you don't learn much about this system. You really need to look at what format the information is represented, in what format it's represented in these representations. And that's something that you can do by using the cross-condition generalization performance, which is reported here. Again, every point is a different dichotomy. So the nice thing here is that you see that there are only 2 dichotomies that have a significant cross-condition generalization performance. One is parity, and the other one is magnitude. And then there is a large gap here, and all the others are actually indistinguishable from a representation in which the centroids would be at random locations. Okay, so this is a good diagnostic tool. It's telling us that there is a very special structure here. We can identify it, and we can do it in a totally unbiased way. We don't need to know a priori what are the variables that are represented in this special abstract format that are disentangled. Okay, so we are going to use these techniques to try to characterize what happens in the real brain. And I will start from the paper that actually introduced this conceptual framework. This is already published and came out in Cell a couple of years ago. And this story would not exist without the data set collected by Silvia Bernardi in Daniel Salzman's lab, and the great theoretical contribution of Marcus Benna and Mattia Rigotti, who really developed the entire conceptual framework. Okay, so now we are considering monkeys, and I'm going to show you the data for one brain area, but you should read the paper because we actually have much more to say about these representations. Okay, let me describe very briefly the task. So it's a relatively complicated cognitive task. It's certainly difficult to train a monkey on this task, in which there is a bunch of stimuli, 4 different stimuli that are totally meaningless, fractals, and they trained the monkey to respond in a different way to these different stimuli. So in particular, they had to respond by releasing a bar to stimulus A and by holding a bar to stimulus B. Release again in response to C, hold in response to D. And they would get a reward in this case for A and B if they do the right thing, or they essentially would avoid a punishment, which is a timeout, if they don't respond correctly in C and D. So they're still motivated to do it. Okay. Now, this is in context 1. Now, without any warning, they would switch to a context 2, where you have a different task set or a different set of visual motor associations. So same stimuli, but different responses and different outcomes. So monkeys can learn this task. And context is a pretty abstract concept for them. It's certainly something they didn't know anything about. Now, when you look at the representations, and this is literally what we did. We looked at the representations using multidimensional scaling. This is what you get. You have this very nice arrangement. So, every condition here is characterized by 3 labels, actually 4 in this case. So the context, the stimulus that is presented, whether the monkeys got a reward, that would be a plus, and then whether the monkeys responded hold or release. And now you can see this beautiful representation that is basically a cube. And if you look at the labels, they're all very nicely arranged. So for instance, context 1 is at the top, context 2 is at the bottom, this plus and plus and plus on this face, minuses on this other face, and so on. So this is a beautiful example of a disentangled representation. You have that all the coding directions are approximately parallel for context, for value, which is another very relevant variable for the monkey, and for action. Okay, so there's a lot to say about these representations, but this is published. And so you can read the paper and you can see that these representations are actually different in different time intervals. They're very dynamic and in different brain areas. But in particular, I'm trying to summarize here a really long paper. Context, action, and value are disentangled abstract variables. There are differences. You can find data dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, ACC, and hippocampus. They are dynamic, as I said, and in all the areas, we always see this very high shattering dimensionality. So that's something you will not be able actually to highlight in this low dimensional projections. But if you look at the original high dimensional space, and all the analysis that we have done is in the original high dimensional space, you can actually realize that the points can be separated in any way you like. Okay, now you might wonder whether there are just a few neurons that are responsible for this, and all the others are just, mixing all these variables in a complicated nonlinear way. And you have that these neurons are highly specialized. So you would have neurons that encode context, neurons that encode value, neurons that encode action. Okay, so this is not the case. It's not the case in this data set. It's not the case in any of the data sets that we analyzed. This idea that the neurons are the functional units of the brain and somehow you find populations of neurons that are specialized at encoding only one variable is simply wrong. So not only that's wrong, but you also don't find that these very few neurons that by chance might encode one variable more than the others are responsible for this nice enhanced generalization ability. It's really a distributed representation, and we're showing it in this way here. So we started from the full representation, and we did the analysis by essentially ablating some of the neurons progressively. When you go from here, this is 0 ablation, and this is 40 neurons. And you first remove all the neurons that are highly specialized, and so that would be this solid line. Or you remove neurons that encode something, but they're not specialized. And you see the curves actually go down, and they had to go down because they're throwing away some information, but they go down at exactly the same rate. So they're not really more important than any other neuron that you have. And the vast majority of neurons actually don't have this kind of specialization. Okay, so what happens in humans? So we are really lucky because we are working with Yuri Mincha, who is a Caltech and in a Wally Rutishauser lab. And they do experiments in humans. They do electrophysiology. And in particular, they did exactly the same experiment that we did on monkeys. So this is 2 sessions. So, monkeys are overtrained. Humans cannot be overtrained. The whole experiment has to be done in 1 day. And they trained the humans in 2 sessions using exactly reinforcement learning as in the monkey case. So you see, during the first session, this is the behavior, the inference behavior. In the first session, it's relatively low, and then it goes up. So what I mean by inference behavior is that essentially, when you switch from one context to the next, the very first time you change the rule, the subject cannot know that, and so the performance is very low. But the second time, it can infer that for some other stimulus, you have to use the other rule that is available. And of course, humans do it, monkeys also do it, but only when they know very well the task. And so that's what you see in the second session. Okay, so now this is the kind of representations that you get. So in session 1, you basically have this structure that is pretty much one-dimensional. You can barely decode context, but you can. You can certainly decode value very strongly. All the other variables are basically a chance. Okay, that's why I'm focusing on these 2 variables. And value is the only variable that is in an abstract format. It's somehow disentangled. Okay, so you see the coding directions, the red coding directions for context are kind of orthogonal. But during learning, something happens, which is basically to flatten these representations and to expand the distances between context 1 and context 2. And the nice thing is that in session 2, then you get these disentangled representations of context and value. These are the only 2 variables that are disentangled, at least in the hippocampus. Okay, so now, before learning, many dichotomies are decodable, but only value is in an abstract format. And it's not too surprising. It's a very important concept. It's certainly there from the very beginning. After learning, context becomes abstract only in hippocampus and in a pre-SMA, it's another area, not in ACC, OFC, or in the amygdala. The shattering dimensionality, which is relatively high, I mean, we have less neurons in this case, but it's relatively high in all the areas. It certainly increases with learning, which is another important thing to keep in mind, because if you start from a random network, you already have a pretty high shattering dimensionality, but it looks like learning certainly increases also this quantity. Okay, so now let me switch to a different type of concepts, and I want to focus now on familiarity, which is one of the most abstract concepts that you can imagine. It's something that you can apply to any kind of item that you see for the very first time, and you can right away say, I've seen this, or I haven't seen it. So this is a work that I've done in collaboration with Steve Siegelbaum's lab, and in particular, Lara Boyle and Lorenzo Posani did all the experiments and the analysis. And it's a really beautiful series of experiments. So this is just to give you an idea. It's one of the many experiments that they did. They have a mouse running around in this arena, and there are other 2 mice under these wire cups, and they can interact with them. So there are a few variables here. Position, whether the animal that is moving around where we are recording from is on the right or on the left. It's interacting with the right mouse or the left mouse. There is the mouse identity under this wire cup, and the familiarity. And they tried all possible combinations. It's really a long series of experiments to reconstruct the representational geometry. So you have to look at the paper to see all the details, but let me summarize the kind of geometry that you get. So you get, if you consider now only novel mice, so these are the mice that our protagonist is interacting with, okay? So what you see is this very nice low-dimensional representation. It's really low-dimensional. It's more low-dimensional than what we expected. And you clearly see that two variables, position and identity, are very nicely disentangled. They really are in orthogonal spaces. Now, what happens when the mice become familiar? And I'm talking about littermates, so they're very familiar to the mouse that is exploring the arena. So what happens is that you have this transformation. So you have a shift in this direction, but you also have this nice distortion. So basically, what you get in the end is that familiarity is actually in an abstract format. It's disentangled from position and identity. But this shift is accompanied by this nonlinear distortion in all possible directions that increases the dimensionality of the representation for the familiar animals. We realize that this is really important for memory. So, this kind of low dimensional structures are very important for generalization, and especially if you're learning something new, but they're not good for memory capacity. And you really need this nonlinear distortion to have a good memory capacity. You can see the proof in the paper, and we actually showed that the number of memories you can store scales only with the number of latent variables if you have these disentangled representations, and not with the number of neurons that you have in your network, which can be much larger. Okay, what happens in humans? So again, this is with Yuri, and they have a different experiment in this case. So there are two blocks of trials, one in which the subject is asked whether they have seen the image or not, and other blocks of trials where they asked whether the stimulus is a fruit or not. Okay, so this is the kind of geometry that we get. So again, here at the bottom, we have familiar stimuli, and here we have new stimuli. So now you see that familiarity is again in an abstract format, category is disentangled, and task type is disentangled. Now, you might think that this is almost unavoidable, but it's not. So for instance, if you look at a different brain area, this was in the medial temporal lobe, which includes also the hippocampus. And now you look at ACC, this is a kind of representation you get. Okay, so it's again MDS, and you certainly don't have that nice organization. There is still some organization that you can highlight by projecting on a lower dimensional space, but I can just tell you that task type and category are actually disentangled. Whereas here in this case, in the hippocampus, also familiarity. Okay, so what happens in monkeys? So this is something we did with the Doris South group. And you can see in, this is in IT, in one of the face patches, and they're presenting faces to the monkey. You can see again that you have these very nice disentangled representations. Here we have linear combinations of features that characterize the face, like the distance between the eyes, the length of the nose, and so on. Okay, so now here at the bottom, you have essentially the novel faces, and here you have the familiar faces. And this is for the initial response. You just see this kind of shift. So during the trial, you present the face, and you look at the initial response. For familiar faces, it would just be shifted. So for instance, a decoder trained on the face features for novel faces, it would work right away also for familiar faces. However, this is not true if you look at the late part of the response. So again, this is for novel faces, you see this nice disentanglement. For familiar faces, they're still disentangled, but the space is now not aligned to the space of the novel faces. Okay, so you have this kind of torsion. We still don't know whether you have a nonlinear distortion or not, because we don't have enough familiar faces to perform the analysis. But there's certainly some kind of distortion. Okay, so this is summarizing what we know about familiarity. Familiarity is represented in an abstract format in the hippocampus, in rodents, in humans, and in IT and in perirhinal cortex, not in human ACC. The identity of individuals is more decodable for familiar individuals in the cortex, and less so in the hippocampus. And you certainly have nonlinear distortions, not everywhere, but we certainly see them in the experiments on rodents in the hippocampus. We don't see much of these distortions in the MTL of humans, but again, the task is different, and it's not really only a memory task, so it's difficult to compare the two experiments. Okay, so one last example that I can show you in the final 5 minutes is the following. So I want to show you that this is not happening only in cognitive areas, but it's happening a lot also in sensory areas. I mean, we have seen an example in IT, in infratemporal cortex, which is basically one of the last stages of the visual system. But this happens also in primary sensory cortex. So in particular, this is again in rodents, and it's in somatosensory cortex. And it's a great collaboration with Randy Bruno's lab, and Ramon Nogueira did all the analysis that I'm going to show you. So the barrel cortex is a beautifully anatomically organized part of the cortex, where you basically see these structures so these barrels where you have neurons that seem to be specialized at encoding the movements, the angles, the touches of a particular whisker. Okay, so each of these barrels seems to be specialized for one particular whisker. Okay, so the experiment they did is significantly more complex than what people normally do. So they, typically they stimulate only one whisker at a time, or they can detect texture of a particular stimulus. What we did was to train the animal to report whether an object is convex or concave. So you have these objects with different convexity, different concavity, and they are placed at different distances from the face of the animal. The animal is in complete darkness, and simply by touching the object, it has to report whether the object is convex or concave. So they're really good at doing this. They can certainly do it. And this is the kind of representation that we get. So again, it's much more low dimensional than what we thought. And you basically can see that these variables are the number of touches for each whisker, for whisker 1, 2, and 3. You can see that these three variables are perfectly disentangled. Okay, so number of C1 contacts is in this direction, C2 contacts is in this direction, C3 contacts is in that direction. Okay, so now you might wonder, okay, maybe this is one case where the neurons are specialized. So, they're recording from C1, C2, and C3, and you might have a situation where the neurons in C1, they encode only C1. So basically, this would be, for instance, one neuron that encodes only C1, and analogously for C2 and C3. But it's not the case, even in this brain area. If you look at these three different columns and you use one of these encoding models of Ramon Nogueira, you can see that basically neurons in the three different columns, C1, C2, and C3, they encode all the variables that are relevant for the task, and in particular the touches for the different whiskers. Even if you're in a C1 column, you see actually a lot of information about C2 and C3. Okay, so what did we learn? So it's time to conclude. So what is the take-home message here? The first one is that disentangled abstract representations are everywhere in the real brain. That's probably something that we should keep in mind. Okay? So the second one is that this kind of representational geometries are very dynamic. During the trial, during learning, they change all the time, and we can learn a lot by analyzing them. We really need to go beyond simply, decoding individual variables. We need to look at the format in which these variables are represented, because that can change a lot, and it might be the only thing that actually changes. Okay, so typically, in all the data sets that we analyzed, I didn't have time to show you this ablation analysis for all the data sets, but it's true for all of them, that disentangled representations are not aligned to the neuronal axis. The neurons actually respond to all the relevant variables. They have what we call mixed selectivity. They have very diverse responses. The representations are highly distributed across multiple neurons. So it's really important, whether you're considering an artificial system or the real brain, to analyze populations of neurons and don't focus too much on single neuron properties. Okay, so one thing that is missing that I didn't have time to talk about and is still work in progress is to find some direct relation between the representational geometry and behavior. We already have some evidence that this is the case. We have a couple of papers where we show that you can very nicely predict the behavior by looking at the geometry, but more is needed, and we have other 2 works in progress, and hopefully we will be able to upload them to bioRxiv pretty soon. Okay, so I will stop here, and I'll be happy to discuss and take questions, and I'll leave the relevant papers here on the final slides. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Stefano. We have one question. I think we are slightly over time here, 30 seconds over time, but maybe we can quickly respond to this.
Sorry, I thought the timer was telling me the time I had.
No, it's just about perfect, and we have 4 minutes for the discussion left.
Right. So, Felix, would you like to ask the question?
Oh, sure. I guess I can read it. I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on, what the necessary implementations or architectures that would be needed to have multiple concept spaces that are like concurrently active, such as if they were like hierarchically organized, with relevant transformations between them, so that, these different concept spaces can also support the different groupings or, categories or clusters that may actually be conflicting depending on the context.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very important issue. So I showed you examples where there are multiple concepts that are simultaneously represented. So for instance, like parity and magnitude. And that's something that you can actually get almost for free every time you use a gradient method like backpropagation. It's not too surprising because you want to be able to generalize as much as possible. So you must have some kind of structure that resembles what I showed you and that is similar to these disentangled representations. But yes, you can certainly represent multiple concepts along different axes or different subspaces. When you have a hierarchy, then that's a much harder problem. And it's a problem that we are studying now with Matteo Allman. And we are trying to find how to analyze this kind of situations. And typically, you're totally right. You need to consider basically only some subgroups of different conditions where you can perform this analysis. Because if you consider all of them, you have a lot of contradictory groupings that actually might hide the interesting low-dimensional structures that you can observe in the representations. So it's work in progress, but it's really essential to go in that direction and try to develop the analytical tools.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please feel free to post the questions in the chat channel. The link is provided here. Stefano, you've shown some ablation studies and where you had like almost 40% of the neurons dropped and the accuracy drop seemed quite minimal compared to the total drop in the neurons.
Yes, okay, so first let me clarify that, these are not real ablation studies. We didn't ablate the real brain. We just didn't consider some of the neurons in the analysis. But you're totally right that the representations are highly distributed. And so you can remove even half of the neurons and you will still have a lot of information. Even if you basically sort the neurons according to some criterion. For instance, you first remove the neurons that have the maximal information about one particular variable, you can actually still decode all the task relevant variables. This is true for in all the brain areas, and even for classical quantities like the position of an animal in the hippocampus. We have a paper with Fabio Stefanini in Neuron, where we basically throw away all the place cells that pass the classical criteria based on mutual information, and then we can still decode the position of the animal. Again, this is because the representations are highly distributed, and this is true both in the real brain and in artificial neural networks, in deep networks, for instance. This kind of ablation studies actually have been done first in the machine learning community, and they show very similar things.
Thank you. I think we have one quick question here. Is how the brain learns these disentangled representations similar to how VAEs work?
I mean, the short answer is that we don't know. I mean, there are a lot of methods in the machine learning community to get this kind of representations. State-of-the-art methods are basically related to what you can do in a variational autoencoder and all the possible variations of these systems, beta variational autoencoders, and so on. However, there must be some more natural ways of doing it. That's certainly one way, but another possibility that we are exploring is what you get, for instance, when you train a very simple feed-forward network to perform multiple tasks that depend on a certain number of latent variables. And even in that case, we have a paper with Jeff Johnston on bioRxiv. You get these disentangled representations very nicely, and even with reinforcement learning. So yeah, it's work in progress. There are a lot of ways of getting them. We don't really have our favorite way at the moment that somehow encourages the system to get these disentangled representations.